Good evening. Today is Monday, December 13th, 2021, and this is the 77th episode of New Paradigms. I'm your host, Sargis Sangari. My honored guest today is a good friend, Dr. Ely Karmon. Dr. Karmon is a senior researcher and scholar at the International Institute for Counter-Terrorism, ICT, and a senior fellow at the Institute for Policy and Strategy, IPS, at the Interdisciplinary Center, IDC, which is located in Herzliya, Israel, where he's coming to us today. He lectures on international terrorism and also chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, or known as CBRN terrorism, and Masters of Arts Counter-Terrorism Studies at IDC, a member of the United Nations Security Council Affairs Division, SCAT, as a regional expert on terrorism and also counterterrorism, and a member of the International Permanent Observatory, or in this case IPO, on security measures during major events that are held at the United Nations Inter-Regional Crime and also Justice Research Institute, better known as UN-ICRI, for Tunis, Italy from 2002 to 2008, where in this framework, he was able to participate in the UN seminars preparing the security at the Athens Olympics in 2004, the Turin Winter Olympics of 2006, and most importantly, recently, Beijing Olympics in 2008. He has also served as an advisor to the Israeli Ministry of Defense and the Anti-Semitism Monitoring Forum of the Israeli Government Secretariat. His work field of research includes political violence, international terrorism, CBRN terrorism, and the strategic influence of terrorism and subversion in the Middle East and worldwide. A frequent commentator on Middle East issues in the Israel media and also numerous media outlets worldwide. It is our pleasure, my pleasure, to have him here today on our show specifically. Ely, it's good to have you here, especially given just this past Friday, Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz was here in the States addressing the Israeli-American Council on National Summit in Southeast Florida, where he told the audience specifically that Israel is the only country in the world that has another country, in this case Iran, seeking to destroy it, and is building that capacity and the means to do it. Benny Gantz has stated that as an Israeli Ministry of Defense, he'll never allow it to happen. I hope that we get a chance and an opportunity to talk about it in more detail. Welcome.
Good evening, and thank you for having me on your show.
No, it's good to have you here. I know that the biggest issue is there's in the current crisis that we have right now, it seems like the talks on possibly a new Iran nuclear deal is not going well. And I just want to make sure that as the events are developing, that we are focused and mindful of the fact that if those discussions fail, the only other step is to be able to somehow stop Iran from developing its capacity to be able to strike Israel. I am sure that Israel is doing whatever it can, whether it be through cyber or other clandestine operations to stop that. But I do want to initially have our audiences understand what Israel is dealing with. And you have brought a number of slides for us that we're going to jump into. But maybe as we're looking at those slides, also be able to finally develop the sense of what needs to happen as far as diplomacy across the board to deal with this issue of Iran over the next few years, if not over the next decade.
One of the problems that we have at this moment, the beginning of the negotiations, is not only beginning, it's not practically the 6 months that there are negotiations behind the scenes and now officially in Vienna between the great powers, the 5 great powers, and Iran. The Iranians, after the United States left the nuclear agreement, the JCPOA from 2015, have advanced tremendously in their preparations to break to nuclear capability, military capability, and this endangers Israel practically on all levels. First of all, clearly, a nuclear device in the hands of a very radical regime, which for years actually since its inception, is threatening Israel of destruction. Israel is the only state in the United Nations which is threatened by one other member of the United Nations. And I don't see the international community speaking about this special situation. But we consider the nuclearization of Iran not only Israeli problem, or not mainly Israeli problem. The nuclear Iran is, first of all, threat to the region, to the Middle East, because immediately after the neighbors of Iran will know that they have the nuclear capability, the military nuclear capability, they will begin to develop their own nuclear programs. And I speak about regional powers like Turkey, like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and even the Emirates. And even Jordan speaks about the need to develop a nuclear reactor. And this clearly will provoke a kind of chaos in the international relations, and especially in the security situation, the stability of the Middle East. At the same time, the Iranians are developing and building for the last 15, 20 years long-range missiles. And they have already missiles which are threatening Europe, not only Israel, 2,000, 2,100 meters long range. And they are thinking or working to develop missiles of 5,000 kilometers range, which is a bit like the North Koreans, which threaten today the American territory. So we see that the Iranians are working on all fronts, not only on the nuclear front, but also on subversion. And if you see this map, this is exactly what the Iranian leadership considers to be its playground. In 2017, immediately after the defeats of ISIS in Iraq and Syria, in Mosul and Raqqa, this map is based on declarations of Iranian leaders, which said openly in all the media, we are controlling Beirut, Lebanon, we are controlling Damascus, Syria, we are controlling Baghdad, Iraq, and we are controlling Sana'a, Yemen. So you see here on the map, they are already involved in attempt not only to control politically, if you want, or to have a coalition with these countries, but even to have an extraterritorial presence like they have in Lebanon through the Lebanese Hezbollah bases, and in Syria today, alongside the military bases of the Syrians, very close sometimes to Russian bases, military bases. They have built their own bases, and they are doing the same little by little also in Iraq. They are using the Yemeni territory to attack Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. And we see here, again, an example of already what happened between 2017 2020, after the agreement of 2015, how they fired missiles not only against their the Kurds, for instance, which they consider to be enemies inside Iraq because they are developing guerrilla inside Iran, but also against the American bases in Iraq and in Syria. And we saw that the last year or two, there was no real retaliation by the United States to such attacks. So the problem of the nuclear deal in 2015 was not only that it was a bad agreement on the technical issues, I would say, of the nuclear developments in Iran itself, but it also was not challenging the hegemonic aspirations of Iran, which are using very, very aggressively subversion. They are inciting also politically and international terrorism in all these territories and also beyond. We saw, for instance, in 2018, a wave of terrorist attacks by Iran in Europe. Fortunately, most of them were foiled by the security services and also with the help of the Israeli intelligence. Here we see, for example, the flags of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, of the Hezbollah, which is the yellow one, and the green one is of the Houthis. So Houthis, which now control half of Yemen, they control the capital. They control the capital of Sana'a and most of the harbors, by the way, through which they receive armaments, weapons, including long-range missiles from Iran. they are part of their coalition, of their axis of resistance, what they call. And even the flag of the Houthis now is actually a slogan of the Ayatollah Khamenei of Iran, which says death to America, death to the Jews, and viva Allah, the Islam. Well, again, if you look at the three flags, you see that the goal, the final goal, is not hegemony only in the Gulf. You see, there is the globe. Okay, this is the real final reach, if you want, or ideological and even strategic goal of the Iranians. Iranians are now very active in South America. They are supporting Venezuela, which is an enemy of the United States and of democratic countries, and even sending their oil with their ships. And here you see, again, what they did in Saudi Arabia with the help of the Houthis at the beginning, but then in 2019, they fired long-range missiles and very modern and very efficient, what we call suicide drones, big drones, which have destroyed in one night practically 5% of the facility of Saudi Arabia. And this was not only an economic, very important economic strike to Saudi interests, but also to the international community, which is buying the Saudi oil. And this kind of attacks continue until today. I think 2 days or 3 days ago, the Saudis announced that they succeeded in firing or downing two long missiles which were fired from Yemen.
No, Iran's everywhere. Even here, as you mentioned, Venezuela, we knew that they were operating out of Venezuela. They have one of the largest embassies in Mexico. And even on our southern borders, a lot of the coyotes, we call them, who have actually trafficked people in, you could see them on videos that are out there on YouTube if anybody wants to watch. They're speaking in Farsi, Persian. So 40 years ago, when me and my family had to leave Iran, being Christian Assyrians, you wouldn't be able to have a life under the Islamic Republic. Khomeini stated very clearly that the road to Israel, Jerusalem in this case, I should say, is through Karbala. And they've laid that foundation for a 40-year period, focus on Jerusalem as an end goal. And I think some of the slides that you have here is showing how they're setting up the stage and where they have been able to progress over the past 4 decades. And we'll continue on this. And I do want to ask you some more detailed questions, Professor, on where we're going to go from here. Okay, next slide.
Here we see, if we speak about terrorist activity, international terrorist activity during the last year and a half, a lot of Iranian naval attacks, either on commercial ships or oil tankers, by the which are belonging to the Emirates, for instance, to Bahrain, to not Israeli society, but Israeli tycoons. And also to interest of the United States and the American Navy and other Western navies, which are, especially the British one, which are in the region trying to defend the facilities, the oil facilities, and the free passage through the Hormuz Straits. They are all the time challenged by the navy that the Islamic Revolutionary Guards have built, because the Revolutionary Guards have a different army, which is based mainly on asymmetric warfare. So they have boats, hundreds of thousands of small boats, speedboats, trying to challenge the big ships, the corvette and the American fleet, which is used in this region just to try to deter this kind of terrorist activity, and including, for instance, the passage of weapons to the Houthis in Yemen, or even to Hezbollah and to Syrian regime in Syria, either through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal, or through smuggling. In the past, they were smuggling also to Hamas in Gaza through Sudan, before Sudan became part of the Abraham agreements. So their kind of activity is really very aggressive. They don't stop this kind of activity. In any case, even when we try to challenge them militarily in Syria, for instance, because the Israeli government has arrived at the conclusion that if we permit the building of these extraterritorial bases in Syria, we'll have a new Lebanon. In Lebanon, we have already Hezbollah with 150,000 long-range missiles. Actually, the Hezbollah is the real missile branch of the Iranian army. Some hundreds of missiles that the Iranians have are far away from Israel. But this kind of missiles, 150,000, they cover off all the territory of Israel. In the past, in 2006, in the Second Lebanon War, they struck only to more or less in the south of the Haifa city. But now they are able to cover all the territories, including southern Israel. And by the way, they also use today long-range drones that they have developed, and they have given them to the Hezbollah. And we have Hezbollah drones which arrived to our shores and even penetrated in the Negev, trying to reach the nuclear reactor that Israel has in the south of Dimona. And we see here an example of naval missiles that was used in 2006 against one of our ships, military ships, quite successful, by the way, because in that case, our Navy was not aware that Hezbollah has this capability. And by the way, they received these Chinese ground sea missiles from the Iranians. And we know that the Hezbollah, besides their own people trained in Iran, they have Iranian specialists which are trying, for instance, in the last 2-3 years to upgrade. There are already present missiles which are quite, some of them are obsolete. So in the last 2-3 years, Iranians trying to smuggle through Syria, by the way, through Iraq, through Syria, sometimes direct flights to Damascus, special devices, not very big devices, which are quite easy to smuggle in order to upgrade to these missiles to be exact, precise missiles. And this threatens not only the civilian population, but clearly is threatening the, if you want, strategic assets of Israel. We speak about power plants. We speak about the two nuclear reactors. We speak about the big harbors and the electricity grid, and clearly the airports and the military bases. I don't know if you can use from one of the slides. I put a link to a Hezbollah site where you see a movie of 2.5 minutes, what they want to hit on Israeli territory, very openly. They say, we know exactly through the GPS and the information that we have, all the coordinates of these very strategic facilities, and we will strike at them. And this is done only with the possibility of having the Iranian support. I consider, by the way, we saw the flags, okay? The Hezbollah is practically part of the, I speak the leadership, I don't speak about the people which are civilians or fighters. The leadership of the Hezbollah is completely subjected to the leadership in Tehran. The leadership of Ayatollah Khamenei is the maximum authority from the point of view of the Hezbollah. They don't recognize the authority of the Prime Minister of Lebanon or even the President of the Parliament. The maximum authority, which is giving the orders, strategic orders, is the Ayatollah Khamenei and the regime or the government in Tehran. Until lately, it was thought that by our intelligence, although I had another idea at the time in 2006, that this was a mistake by the Hezbollah leadership to attack Israel and provoke what was called the Second Lebanon War, which was, from the point of view of Hezbollah, quite a success, not from the Israeli part. But we know today that General Qasem Soleimani, which was the head of the Al-Quds force, which is the main force for the territorial expansion of the Iranian regime in the region, in the Middle East. During the war in July-August 2006, he was in the bunker with Nasrallah leading the war against Israel. So this was an Iranian war. And after the war, they began to understand the importance of the long-range missiles and sent a lot of these missiles, little by little, to the Hezbollah. And one of the errors, strategic errors, in my opinion, is that the Israeli governments, all the governments, beginning the 2000s when we withdrew from Lebanon, was not to challenge this arsenal, which developed from 10, 15,000 in the late 90s to 150 1 year or 2 years ago.
No, and it's funny that you mentioned the second Lebanese war, because during that war, I remember watching the news outlets, the major news outlets we had at that time, and they were interviewing a so-called Palestinian fighter or Hezbollah fighter. Of course, they weren't showing his face because he had asked if he could just basically point the camera down. So they're showing his shadow and they're asking him questions. And you could just tell by his accent that he's an Iranian, that there's nothing Arab about him, or he's not from the region. So we knew that, Iran was there. They were developing the situation for themselves. Like on the drone issues that you talked about, Professor, we know right now Iran actually has a capacity building facility in Venezuela where they're actually developing their drone capabilities there. And their drones that they have there can reach U.S. soil if they choose to. And those drone capabilities have an ability to conduct limited, but still have the capability to conduct a attack against our electrical structures, in this case using the electromagnetic pulse capabilities that they carry. So they can do that. The technology is there. My worry is when you showed the Chinese design weaponry systems, and you did mention that initially Iran was in Sudan. I just came back from the Kenya, from the Horn of Africa. We were doing a regional study. That's one of the reasons I was preparing mission prep. I wasn't able to get to Israel this time for the anti-terrorism conference, because in October of this past year I had to go. And I'll tell you that initially they had a footprint there with what happened with the coup in Sudan. ISIS right now is fighting in northern Sudan, trying to fight against Israel's positions that they have been able to secure within the region, at least for Israeli security. But Iran also does funnel money, if it can, to whoever it can use for its strategic benefit. And I know that Iran's footprint is a little bit limited still in the Horn of Africa, but it's trying to reach out there, and mostly is doing it through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, in this case SCO, which is China's a lead on. So the missile technologies that are coming in are really China fighting against the United States for control of the Middle East, to include where even in northern Iraq, they're teaching the Sunni Muslim Kurds Mandarin Chinese, because China wants to use Iran for its footprint. So it will funnel money to Iran the way it can, however it can launder it, to ensure that it gives Iran a strategic platform as it sits at the Security Council lead, in order for it to be able to expand itself within the region. And unfortunately, I don't know if a lot of our folks know this issue. And as you say, with the technology being developed, just yesterday, a couple of days ago, we got the news story that even our Intel, a major American tech company, is going now to Taiwan to sit and possibly turn over its chip manufacturing to TSMC. TSMC itself is really, if you look at the history, is Huawei. Huawei is the Chinese Communist Party. So as we start losing this capability, you're going to have to develop it somewhere. And if the Chinese are going to control it and they're willing to give it to the Iranians, eventually the systems that are being used against Israel that have been developed over the past 4 years are going to get much more sophisticated, much more capable, and will be much more accurate when it comes to attacking the strategic targets or any target in Israel.
Speaking about China, one of the problems that we have, not only us, but also the United States and the European Western countries in the negotiations for the nuclear deal is the involvement of China. China is supporting Iran even much more than Russia. And a year ago, they have signed a strategic agreement, and China has decided to invest $400 billion in Iran, which means not only they are supporting politically, they are supporting economically by buying the Iranian oil, and now they are giving the Iranians the backing to develop their own army, because the Iranians don't have a real army. They are basing themselves more on missiles and drones, and the money of the Chinese political support gives them the impression, at least, or the feeling that they can be very tough during these negotiations, and they are not accepting any compromises. On the contrary, their position is tougher and tougher.
Professor, I want to go through all the slides first, and I do want to come back and take a look at some of the questions we have.
Sure. What we see today here is actually the presence of Hamas missiles in southern Lebanon. This is a development which appeared in the last 2-3 years, as probably clearly you, but a part of your public knows. The Hamas, which is controlling Islamic Revolutionary Movement, controls Gaza Strip since 2007, is opposed to the Palestinian Authority and its Fatah party, which controls the Palestinian Authority, and they have already a very important force of missiles and drones. Most of these missiles and drones have been provided by Iran when there was possible to smuggle them through Sinai, as I said, Sudan, Sinai, even Egypt, but also giving them the technology. And the part of this technology was Iranian new technology, but the Hamas succeeded in developing their own facilities inside Gaza, and even paid to some two specialists. One was a Tunisian, by the way, in Tunisia, and one was a Palestinian in Malaysia, which had the task to develop the project of drones. And we see the examples of the Ababil drones, which are actually a copy of the Iranian drones. They were not successful during the last May 2021 operation against Israel, which was a military conflict which began. They are firing missiles on Jerusalem. For the first time, the Hamas threatened the holy city of Jerusalem. And this was the reason that Israel had to attack the Gaza Strip and the Hamas forces. And we see also that the Iranians were responsible with the development of subterranean tunnels which threatened the civil population mainly for many years. And just last week, our Minister of Defense finished 65 kilometers long special fence, which is not only 6-meter fence above the ground, but also inside the ground, which is using also very sophisticated technology in trying successfully, I think, to stop this kind of activity of Hamas. By the way, previously you show also a map of northern Israel on the border with Syria, where the Hezbollah, with the Iranian support, also technological and also financial, I think they spent some dozens of millions of dollars in order to build these tunnels on our border. 6 tunnels were discovered 2 years ago. I think it's before that. And we discovered in a very secret operation, and these tunnels were destroyed. The tunnels were built in order to permit the elite force of the Hezbollah, part of the forces which fought for the last 8-9 years in Syria, alongside the regime of the Bashar al-Assad dictator, trying to penetrate Israeli territory in case of a conflict, in case of a war in Lebanon or even in Syria. Here, I think we have, if I'm not, the Hezbollah bases, which are now on Syrian territory, 116 bases, according, by the way, of an agreement between Russia, United States, Israel, and Jordan. Most of what you see in southern Syria had to be expelled from there. But we see that the Russians did not succeed in expelling not only the Iranians, but also the Hezbollah and Iraqi and Afghani militia. You see, they imported Afghani Shiites from Afghanistan to Iran. They lived in the refugee camps of the Hazara Shia in Iran. They were paid by the regime in Tehran and brought to Syria not only to fight against ISIS, not only to fight against the opposition, which is a legitimate opposition to the regime, but also to try to replace many of the villages and the small towns where the Sunnis were living. And these communities practically were destroyed by the regime and the Iranians. They had to become refugees, either in Jordan, in Turkey, or even in Europe. And these Shias from Iraq and from Afghanistan are brought by the Iranians in order to implant them and to leave them there as a new community, changing the demography, the traditional demography of Sunni majority in Syria itself. And here we see what Israel has to do during the last 3-4 years because of this Iranian Hezbollah and pro-Iranian militias in Syria. Israel has decided not to permit a new Lebanon, a new Hezbollah, which could control and build a missile platform in southern Syria, but Israel has to attack these new bases. There can be bases of Air Force, but also missile bases and facilities which are developing the, if you want, the new generation of precise missiles of Iran and Hezbollah in Syria and in Lebanon. And here we see a map, which is an old map, because this was the wave of terrorist attacks by Syria and Hezbollah in 2011-2012. Most of these attacks were foiled. Only two were successful, one in Bulgaria in 2012 and one in New Delhi. But this kind of network shows how Iran and Hezbollah are practically implanted in a lot of countries. By the way, these are not all the attacks which were foiled. As part of the information is still, I would say, it is secret. But this shows how they can challenge by subversion and terrorism the regimes in the Western world, but also in the Muslim world and the African countries. Here we have what happened in Beirut in 2020, the big explosion of ammonium nitrate in the harbor of Beirut. The harbor of Beirut, the security of the harbor of Beirut, was and is still in the hands of the Hezbollah people. And nobody knows until today. They did not permit a real investigation in this huge accident, which killed 200 people, destroyed thousands of houses, apartments, and provoked an immigration of thousands of, tens of thousands of Lebanese because they don't have homes. If we see immediately what was the result, I mean the destruction, we can understand also what lies behind the arsenal. You see how it looked 24 hours after the explosion, and this is only part of the destruction because a great part of the city itself was destroyed. But we know that ammonium nitrate has been if you want, a weapon of preference by Hezbollah and the Iranians in order to prepare a global infrastructure. A global infrastructure because, and I show you here the list of the places where they took control of some houses or apartments in Great Britain, in Germany, in Cyprus, and according to American sources, also in France, Italy, and Greece. Part of them were discovered with support of the Israeli and American intelligence. And the result, at least partial result of this, was not only to understand the threat that dozens of tons of ammonium nitrate can produce such kind of destruction, but also they are preparing a basis to future attacks in case of a strategic decision by the Tehran regime. And not only there, but we saw that even in Bolivia, far away in 2017, the Bolivian authorities under Evo Morales, that was the president, a very close ally of the Iranians, and they discovered that 2.5 tons of ammonium nitrate was found in their territory, and they used the part of this explosive to prepare 1 or 2 suicide cars, and to use them not in Bolivia, but in Chile and Peru. So you see how this huge international network is working in a very close cooperation between the Islamic Revolutionary Corps and the Hezbollah, and sometimes also the Ministry of Intelligence of Iran, which is mainly responsible for assassination of opponents, opposition members, important opposition members. If you see now, in 2018, there were a wave of attacks in Europe, which fortunately were foiled by the security authorities. Also, as I said, the Israeli intelligence was involved, and they were ready to attack a very important conference near Paris, where very important personalities, including, by the way, I think Mr. Giuliani, which we know he was a very important personality in the Trump administration, was present at this opposition conference. And the head of this network was an intelligence agent of Iran. He was staying at the embassy in Vienna, but he was caught in Germany, and he was condemned to 20 years in prison in Germany. Now, unfortunately, the European countries decided only to punish the Ministry of Intelligence, so the specific department which was responsible for this wave of attacks. By the way, 2 attacks were succeeded in the Netherlands, and 2 opposition members were assassinated in 2017 and 18. But the decision was to put sanctions on this department, not on Iran and not on Hezbollah, because Hezbollah was also partially involved, especially in France.
No, it's funny that you mentioned it, and you've done a wonderful job, Professor, of kind of showing everybody how globally this network is operating. When you had the map up, when we were looking at even in Bangkok, Thailand, the significance of that was, me being a individual that is tied to the Ravens Challenge Asiana, where we actually changed the explosive ordnance, also SWAT, from various different nations that came down to Thailand to train specifically the SWAT and the also EOD for the Thai government. That incident really took back and it surprised the Thai government, because it was literally an attack that was done in an area where Iran actually moves a lot of what it needs to finance its terror operations. In this case, moving gems, and sometimes they're also involved in human trafficking through those areas. So the fact that they were able to do that even in a territory that they shouldn't have brought any eyes to themselves goes to show how erratic they could be when it comes to their operations. Being a member of the Ravens Challenge, when it comes to U.S. diplomatic issues here in the States, and looking at training that we have down there, that was one of the test beds that we always used. Fast forwarding, when I was in Iraq and Syria, and we were advising the Syrian Christian multi-force structures to fight against ISIS between 2014 and 2017. We were bringing those lessons learned and applying them to train the world militaries that wanted to come to that training facility in Thailand. And a lot of it had to do with techniques, procedures that, although ISIS was copying, was really being used by the Iranians for their operations, to include how they were using drones to be able to literally go after Iraqi special operational forces, even though Iraq is a country that they have under their control, to include the most recent strike that they did against the prime minister of Iraq unsuccessfully, even though they still control Iraq as a general. So the way they attack and how they operate, there's a lot of internal division still here in Iran, and the hardliners are in a position that they cannot really flex any which way. The only thing is the ultimate goal of getting into Jerusalem and the final destruction of Israel is really what is at mind. Trying to convince an American policymaker to understand that is difficult, because as Israel looks at all these nations are being nothing more than just branches of the Iranian government, U.S. still looks at them in niches. And as Israel has to fight against Iran and be preoccupied with the existential threat that Iran poses to Israel, Americans are focused on either on internal issues, or they're looking at China as being a global competitor, not tying the fact that it's China, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Iran being a signatory to include Russia, who's providing capability even for Turkey to develop its facility for its nuclear fuel, which in the long run it could use if it wants to counter Iran, if Iran ends up getting the bomb. My question to you, Professor, is, and as we're looking at the closing this piece, now we go back to the second Lebanese War, even going back prior to Barak, the leadership of Israel. Has there been anything that Israel is looking at maybe changing its approach to the region? Because if you think about it, all you're doing is delaying this capacity building by Iran. You could go out, you could kill his scientists, you could maybe use cyber against his facilities. But if you're going to just delay, doesn't that mean that maybe there should be a different policy approach? Or are we looking at a regime change? And if that regime change happens, is that really going to change what Iran is looking at as far as the ultimate goal, which the revolution was built on in these 40 years, where they have been trained and raised to be nothing more than just enemies of Israel? Is there anything that maybe you can see that could be a turning point, with maybe a new nexus with the Abraham Accord, that changes the complexities of Israeli foreign policy in this approach?
Unfortunately, we are in a very difficult position. After the withdrawal of the United States, the decision of President Trump to withdraw from the agreement, but at the same time not really threatening the Iranian militarily. The only thing that President Trump wants to kill Qasem Soleimani, the general, which was responsible for all this expansion of the Iranian regime in the region. And he was, I think, killed because he was preparing the takeover of the American embassy in Baghdad. And there was sufficient experience of what happened on the ground days before that. And the American administration understood that this is a very dangerous moment, that what happened in Tehran in 1979 could happen in Baghdad in 2020, and that the pro-Iranian forces, with the support of Iran, will take control of the embassy, will destroy the embassy, will take possibly, will kidnap or take prisoners American diplomats, and keep them like they kept 444 days dozens of American diplomats in the 70s, end of the 70s and the beginning of the 80s, which I think was one of the most strange diplomatic events, which again did not bring a really retaliation by the Carter administration at the time. And one of the reasons what happens today is that Iran was not challenged during the crisis of the prisoners in Tehran and during the attacks by the Hezbollah under control and ordered by Iran to attack the American Marines and to the attack in the American embassy in Beirut in 1983 and 1984, and also by the way, the French paratroopers in 1983.
Yeah.
Dozens of people, hundreds of people were killed, and the Western powers, the United States and France, decided to leave Lebanon and not punish really not Iran, not Syria, and not the Hezbollah. So I think that what we have today, at least from the point of view of Israel, I think there is a change, which I proposed also several years ago, not to threaten the destruction of Lebanon. We have no interest to destroy Hezbollah by destroying all of Lebanon, because it will be indeed a very difficult war. But we have to deter the patron, the Iranian regime itself. And I speak militarily. With the missiles and the air force that Israel has, because all the orders come from Tehran. And we know from experience of the war in 88 between Iraq and Iran, when Ayatollah Khomeini decided to accept a ceasefire only when the Iraqis threatened to bomb and even sent chemical weapons to Tehran. And the threat to the civilian population, like they threaten our civilian population, I think would influence the decision makers in Tehran. But at the same time, if we speak about the Iranian nuclear facilities and infrastructure, because they have the possibility today to develop quite quickly, they are possibly half a year, some say 2 months, to have sufficiently enriched uranium for a bomb or 2 bombs. But we know that they need to also to develop the engine for the military bomb, perhaps to test it, and also to put it on a long-range missile. This is a process which can take also 1 or 2 years. This is the time that Israel leadership has to prepare the army, and the Minister of Defense Gantz just said in the United States 2 days ago that he gave the orders to prepare the army and the air force in case of necessity to destroy this kind, at least partially and at least temporary, but not to permit Iran to become a real existential threat to Israel. And what we saw in these very few slides is actually what they are preparing. They are not ready to, will not be ready or trying to use the atomic bomb against Israel, but the nuclear umbrella that they will develop, it will permit them to be much more aggressive, not only against Israel, against the American forces, for instance, which are now still in Iraq. Some of them, very few, are left in Syria. They are in the Gulf countries, by the way. The biggest American bases are in Qatar, in Bahrain, vis-a-vis Iran. And a nuclear bomb will permit them to do whatever they want. And therefore, I think they have to be deterred on the one hand by militarily in the issue of developing or not developing the nuclear military capability, and the other one to be stopped in all their strategic subversion and terrorist advance in the region and worldwide.
From your perspective, with the Abraham Accord, and I know you mentioned the Gulf nations, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, and even Sudan being signatories on it, are they able to assist in any which way, contribute to the expansion of this hegemonic aspirations by Iran within the region? Are they going to be able to support either covertly or overtly in this case? Is that assistance going to be just nothing more financial assistance maybe? Or would they be willing to participate in operations against Tehran?
First of all, on the political level, strategic political level, we see a change because of the American weakness and the withdrawal, chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan was a very, very sad and very important event, which projected weakness from the point of view of United States vis-a-vis its enemies, and first of all, Iran, which, by the way, has still today very good relations with the Taliban. And therefore, the Gulf countries, especially if we speak of Saudi Arabia, Emirates, and Bahrain, and even Qatar, they relied always on the American might. But if they see that not only Obama administration, but also Trump administration, and now Biden administration, decide the pivot to Asia involves leaving the Middle East, or leaving the Middle East to its fate. So we see that Saudis and the Emirates went to Tehran to negotiate on the political level how to mend fences with the Iranians. And therefore, the visit of our prime minister, which began on Sunday, is very important in order to see what the Emirati leadership has learned in Tehran and what but I think that on the political level, the Abraham Accords is very important for the standing of Israel in the Middle East. It's important also in the future negotiations for the Palestinian issue. And I'm sure that there is quite good intelligence cooperation between the two, various countries, Israel and the various countries, including, by the way, the Saudis. This kind of cooperation was always a secret for the last 20 years. It was not did not begin yesterday, or with the accord that Premier Netanyahu did. This context and this cooperation existed many times ago. The Mossad was responsible for most of these relationships, secret relationships, and I'm sure that a part of it is intelligence on Iranian capabilities, on Iranian motivations, Iranian thinking, and so on. But again, the more the Iranians will feel stronger, and the United States and Western countries, especially European countries, will appear weaker. Clearly, these small, if you are really small powers or small countries, will decide to not to challenge, but to bandwagon Iran. And this is a serious threat. If it happens, this can threaten the agreements, the Abraham agreements, because Iran is one of the things they will ask. The first thing that they will ask them to cancel this kind of agreements, because from the Iranian point of view, this is a clear political and I would say strategic defeat.
And my question in this capacity would be, I think one thing that is really hard for maybe the American audience to look at, both Netanyahu's administration and now with Bennett's coalition have stated that they're not going to allow Iran to be able to get its hands on a nuclear weapon. However, with that said, as the IAF is not preparing and training for a possible military strike versus those Iranian nuclear facilities possibly, what would be the red line, though? Because we don't really understand the red line from the American perspective. Or what would be your red line to say it's time for Israel to go? Is it a halting its capacity or capability of them being able to weaponize those whatever they have in their hands right now? Or is it something else?
I think there are different red lines for Israel compared to the United States. From the point of view of Israel, nuclear Iran is almost, I don't say existential threat, in my opinion, it's not a real existential threat, but it's almost an existential threat, very serious threat, with all the implications that I said would have on the regional and even internal Israeli situation. I speak about the psychological and economic effects of such a development. But from the American point of view, Iran is far away. They did not react really when Pakistan became nuclearized and when India became nuclearized. But now you have a kind of a very radical regime, which is a direct threat to the United States. They consider the United States the great Satan. Okay, so they are fighting the United States everywhere on the planet, and clearly in the Middle East. And therefore, I think what the United States has is to project a real military threat to dissuade the Iranians. They have to be sure that if they pass this threshold, becoming a nuclear power, there will be consequences, military difficult consequences. There is another possibility that if Israel is left alone, and it has no choice, by the way, as our leadership is behaving and make this declaration, is preparing for such an alternative. And in this case, the question is how the American administration will support or not such kind of military attack on Iran, because this is also very important. There is a threat that such an attack would provoke a regional war, and many other countries, states will be involved. As I said, I don't know how the Turks, for instance, but Turkey all of a sudden is trying to improve relations with Israel, and by the way, with the Gulf countries, the Emirates lately, even is opposed to Qatar in some cases. But Turkey understands that the Iranian nuclear state would be a threat to basic strategic interest of Turkey. And President Erdogan, which is not a great lover of Israel, has to take this in consideration. And thus, I think it's not only the dire economic situation which influences the decision of Erdogan to try to improve relations, but he understands that he needs also the Sunni Arab states at his side, if there will be, I would say, negative developments in the relationship between Turkey and Iran. They have already, by the way, different or contrasting interests in Iraq and in Syria. There is some kind of military activity of Turkey in northern Iraq, and they have, I think, some bases there. And they are controlling a province of Idlib in northern western Syria, and using the opposition, especially jihadist group there, against the Bashar regime, which is an ally of Iran. So we see that Turkey could enter in such conflict with Iran. Egypt also, as the biggest country which wants to return to be the main power in the Arab world, could decide. By the way, they have already agreement with Russia to build civil nuclear reactors. And I think the most threatened would be the Saudis, because the Saudis, although they are armed to the teeth by the United States and even European countries, what they demonstrated in Yemen is that they are not able to fight power like Iran and its proxies. So the Saudis will be, I think, in the case of the Saudis, the challenge will be for the control of the holy sites. And on the religious level, this also is very important for the Shia or the Khomeini regime, which wants to unify the Muslim Ummah, not only under the aegis of Wahhabism, but under the influence of the doctrine of Ayatollah Khomeini.
No, it's a complicated situation, but as complicated as it is, Israel has an understanding, at least I would, that nobody there is your friend. Look, if the Saudis cared about Israel, where were they 40 years ago when Iran decided to march and establish its footprint to be able to cut off Israel and in order to be able to wipe it off the face of the earth? They didn't care at that time. Now they care because their money and their possible position in a power structure is threatened. It's unfortunate. I hope that the U.S. had a better approach to things. I know you mentioned some of the historical issues, but we never had a foreign policy for the Middle East. And when the Iranian government fell and they decided to become Islamists, basically all we did was step across the border, this imaginary border in Iraq, and try to work with the Iraqis to counter Russia. And unfortunately, today, everything that we have is really in the hands and control of the Chinese when it comes to our tech capabilities that we need to use to counter anything that the enemy has on the battlefield. Unfortunately, we're not doing a good job of that either. As in case that when you had Chinese designed missiles making it through the Sinai Peninsula to the Horn of Africa and being used against Israel in the most recent fight against Gaza. And I had a family member who actually, my wife's from Lebanon, a Christian from Lebanon, they had to leave, who was injured during the explosion that took place there. And you have the type of fuel that is used by even the Chinese missiles to be fired. So with Russia, China now in Syria and working with the Iranians to expand what they want for their footprint, with the U.S. kind of basically trying its best to depart the Middle East. How do you see the new map of the Near East changing in the long run? Because it's not going to be what it used to be. How do you see it changing? And I'll give you the last word, Professor. Where do we go from here?
I think we became much more modest last years in trying to evaluate how the world develops and changes, and clearly how the Middle East is changing. It's clearly changing, and it's changing very rapidly. With the beginning of the uprising, which was called the Arab Spring, but from the beginning we didn't believe in the Arab Spring. I had every 6 months some kind of presentation. This was only part of such presentations. And all the time the title was Shifting Alliances. Every 6 months there were another alliance, including in the jihadist camp, into the various groups in Syria and Iraq. And in Africa, you see even the fight between Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And the involvement of Saudi Arabia, of the Emirates, of Qatar, of the Turks, of the Russians, of the Iranians, Hezbollah, militias in Syria itself. And therefore, you couldn't really understand what will happen next month. I don't speak about 10 years from now. And therefore, the situation was stabilized, by the way, very strangely by the Russian intervention in Syria. But even they don't control the situation now. I don't know if you are aware, but inside Syria, the Iranians are challenged by the Russians are challenged by the Iranians on the control of the Syrian army. There are divisions and armies, because they have several armies, don't know how many dozens of divisions. The commanders are either pro-Russians or pro-Iranians. And the Russians have convinced for some time President Assad not to nominate a new chief of staff, because they are trying to impose a pro-Russian chief of staff. So you see how complicated is the situation there. And from our point of view, we have to try to maneuver, if you want, between this very dangerous sense and our relationship with the Russian are very complex also. Again, on the one hand, we have common interests, and we have now mostly free hand in attacking Iranians, Hezbollah in Syria, but we don't know for how much time.
That's unfortunate, but it's a reality. I wish we had another hour, Professor, to talk a little bit more detail. Yeah. But, yes. All we could do is offer our advice to the decision makers.
Thank you for your such a long interview. Yes.
No, it was wonderful. Thank you very much. And like I said, I hope it's unfortunate, but it seems Israel has to go it alone with all the maturations within the region. And as I said a long time ago, you have to know who your enemy is. And unfortunately, we sometimes hope that the enemy is something different than they are. As I told my soldiers, when the guy is aiming the weapon at you, cocking the handle back, you might figure out that he's trying to kill you. and not hope that that round and what he has in his mind is not going to manifest into your chest. So I encourage everybody to understand that this enemy, the only way you could defeat it, you got to conquer it and beat it. And wherever it manifests itself, whether it be in Bangkok and Venezuela or everywhere else, you have to challenge it. And you have to be definite and decisive, and it has to be killed, because that's the only way it understands not to move forward with what it has planned for, not just the destruction of Israel, but destruction of Iran in the long run. Professor, it was wonderful to have you here, Ely. We hope to get you back here again. And next time I'll try, maybe next year we'll get Near East to come out to Israel. We were just
our pleasure to have you here. Yes, physically, not by Zoom. Yeah. And thank you for having me and giving me so much time.
No, thank you very much. And for our audiences, if you take a picture of the QR down there, you can see the bio of the doctor. And then at the same time, I want to thank Center Production that produces our program for us. And if you like the programming that we have, you can support us. Please support United Assyrian Appeal. We do support the Christians in the Near East and adjacent nations. When we need some support this holiday coming up, both in northern Iraq, unfortunately, they're going to go through another genocide by next March, and also Sudan, southern Sudan Christians who are suffering currently based on what is happening within the region. Thank you very much, Doc, and this is New Paradigms.
Thank you.